If you'd please all take your seats. When we recessed, the measure that was under consideration was H.R. 2804, in which the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia had requested a recorded vote. Based on that, the clerk will call the roll on Mr. Collins's amendment.
Mr. Issa?
Yes.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Mica? Yes. Mr. Mica votes aye. Mr. Turner? Aye. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. McHenry? Aye. Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes aye. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Meehan? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Gowdy? Yes. Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Farenthold?
Aye.
Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mr. Hastings?
Aye.
Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Massey? Yes. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton? Mr. Tierney? Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Lewin Grisham? Ms. Lewin Grisham votes no.
That's kind of a long ball no, right? Almost a field goal.
Mr. Jordan, you are not recorded. Mr. Jordan votes aye. Sir, you are
I don't believe you are.
You are not. Mr. Tierney votes no.
Welcome, Mr. Tierney. Well, Mr. Clay, would you like to be recorded? How would you like to be recorded? No urgency. You are not recorded.
Mr.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia. You're not recorded.
Norton votes no. You tell him to close it.
I was just going to advise you, Mr. Chairman, when they say that, how am I recorded? You should just say you voted yes.
Well, he should tell us how to vote.
Yeah.
The clerk will record.
On that vote, sir, 19 yeses, 15 noes.
The amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on, if there's no further discussion, the question occurs. Okay. I now move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 2804 to the House with the recommendation that it do pass as amended. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2804 to the House as amended. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Mica? Mr. Mica votes aye. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes aye. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Meehan? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Farenthold?
Aye.
Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton? Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Lewin Grisham? Ms. Lewin Grisham votes no. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Does anyone else wish to record a vote?
You are, ma'am, as a no.
Are you going to stay a no? This is your chance to change. The clerk will report.
On that vote, sir, 19 ayes, 15 noes.
The resolution is agreed to, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 2804 is ordered, reported to the House as amended.